Well, hello again. It's Marsha Sinetar, and this morning I have a mailbag question. Actually, it comes mostly from people I know, and it has to do with the dialogue sessions. Namely, could you please describe what goes on in the dialogue sessions? Well, okay, I'll do my best, although it's a little amorphous. First of all, let's talk about dialogue. Dialogue is different than a conversation where one person is very often repeating facts or the news or gossip like that. Really, a dialogue, as Thomas Merton once wrote, or I think he said it on a tape of his, it's an exchange of selves. So it's a deeper conversation. I would call my dialogue sessions educative. In other words, there's an exchange not only of each person where I say my bit and you say your bit, and we begin to explore ideas and possibly reshift some of our thinking. It's mutual. It's not just a coaching session where I am the all-knowing giver of advice. It's not just a therapy session where I'm exploring your psyche and trying to modify or improve that. No, it's much more a learning, a lifting of ideas. I remember a friend of mine, John Hargraves, once talking about leadership. And he said leadership is the ability to take an idea and lift it higher, to take thought and lift it higher. And I would say that's what the dialogue sessions, mine, are about. Now we could go back for a minute and think about this idea of lifting thought higher, taking ideas and lifting them higher. We know that the soul is our immaterial being, the part of us that thinks, intends, our consciousness. It's the very essence of our immateriality, let's call it. And so, as one client once said to me when we were finished with the session, he said, this is like having a counseling for the soul. And I would say maybe that's a little grandiose for the informality of what we do, but certainly the idea of moving thought and ideas and our heart, the inner man of the heart, upward toward that which is perfect, the Spirit of God according to your understanding. That's pretty much what the dialogue sessions are about, and yet in a very, very ordinary, pay the bills and chop the wood and carry the water kind of way. So next, let's take a look at who's it for. So who's involved with these dialogue sessions? Well, first of all, these are teleconferences, given the COVID situation that we have right now, and also for years and years, I haven't felt like traveling. I did that for decades, and, enough is enough at a certain point. People who are involved with this little center of mine, which is virtual in the main, tend to be leaders. They tend to be people who are equipped, qualified, mature enough to guide others, influence others, serve others in that framework that I think it was Robert Greenleaf talked about, servant leadership. I think that's a lot of where our dialogue sessions are headed. They're headed in that direction, to be more mature, more equipped, more optimistic and encouraging of self and other. And of course, I would expect those people who want to have a dialogue, it's generally ongoing, occasional sometimes, regularized at other times. I would expect those individuals, A, to be somewhat familiar with my work, and B, to have that constellation of qualities that I talked about, the maturity, the qualifications and training, the mindset to be of help, encouragement, guidance to others. So this would include people who are loosely called helping professionals, counselors and therapists, business leaders, especially human resource individuals. I'm sure I'm missing some, but we could also include the clergy, pastors and priests, and so on. So the other emphasis that I have now, it's really an expectation for myself as well as for those who seek out a dialogue, and that is that they have a spiritual mentality, a depth of psyche to not be offended if I or they start to turn in a very reverential direction, wanting to serve in a way that serves the self and the other in the name of something higher, someone higher. My framework tends to be Judeo-Christian. I've made no secret about that. I've written about it, especially lately. And and it seems like people who seek out this kind of dialogue in the main at the deepest level tend to be people who are not really commercially minded. Yes, money is always a topic. Leadership is generally always a topic. Occupation can be a topic. Vocation will be a topic. Relationships with other people, anxieties, all the stuff of daily life. But down at the deepest level, or up at the highest level, there's this wish to serve upwards, to give it all upwards, so to speak. And that's kind of the best I can do for a description of who. So let's look at some specific, three of them, concrete examples. And I would preface this by saying there are as many ways into the dialogue conversation as there are people. So I'm choosing three that seem to be examples of patterns. But, you can use your imagination for your own situation and see if what you have to offer in your own mind, not talking about in a dialogue session, but in your own mind, what are the patterns of life and growth and learning and development and personal power that I'm dealing with? I think that's a pretty good way to come at some of this. But anyway, three concrete examples of the kinds of dialogue I've had recently. I mean recently, in the last 20 years. One would be general fear, anxiety, the inability to say what one really means to the people that mean the most. I would include stage fright in that, which I've had in spades. And I've written about this, where when I was just coming up as a much younger person, I was, even in school, I couldn't even speak in class. And now, I've learned to lighten up on some of the perfectionistic expectations and deal with that. But when someone has approached me in dialogue about these fears, nameless fears sometimes, very specific at other times, it's not really therapy in my mind, although I do like to have the people that I work with have a therapist on tap, so to speak, to have someone qualified, trustworthy, trained, trustworthy. I've said that twice because that's the biggie, and qualifications, of course. Someone to turn to if things get hairy, if they start to feel very strong emotions, all the symptoms. And of course, since I deal with helping professionals, they tend to know when to turn to a therapist for a second opinion, let's call it. So we would very often go through a learning, where the individuals begin to admit the deeper fear, the lack of, let's say, control, the development of one's own power, personal power. And very often when we have fear, as a young person, there's been someone highly authoritarian that we've wanted to please and felt that we couldn't please. And so the rug seems to be pulled out from under us at the least um, appropriate time, let's call it, when you're in front of an audience, when you're in front of your boss, your manager, when you want to ask for a raise. All these kinds of things deserve attention, deserve a house cleaning, let's call it. So that would be one example. Another would be the opposite of that, where and it seems opposite, where the individual is highly authoritarian, rather rigid, pretty judgmental, and all of that starts to create problems, not only in the workplace, but at home, especially with children, especially with a spouse, relatives, family, where one can't go into a conversation with someone else without imposing or wanting to impose their point of view. So there, the development and the learning, it all has to do with this loosening up, being a little bit more relaxed, a little bit more uh, accepting of other people's point of view. And there's so many ways of coming at this. You couldn't possibly want it all explained in a 3-minute or 5-minute presentation. But that's a specific example, and it comes along in buckets when we talk about people in leadership positions. Let me go to the third concrete example. And it has to do with the highly creative person, the inventive person, the highly intelligent person with a quirk. And when I say quirk, I mean an ability to see, uh, to see the oddity in the pattern, to see the unusual. We call it now thinking outside of the box. But, of course, the highly creative person doesn't think in boxes, never thinks in boxes, and has to bend themselves, twist themselves into box-like shape, and therein lies the problem. The problem is we go into a corporate setting, and I'm speaking from personal experience. We go into a corporate setting, and there is a way, there's a lockstep, there's a script, there's an expectation, there's a box. And the highly creative person doesn't always fit in that box and has a hard time sometimes, not always, unless they're in charge or unless they're particularly adept at skirting the boundary. And some people are very, very good at it. And we just look at our companies that have this enormous advantage when someone in the company, like the head of a company, let's say, not the founder, but the head, maybe the second in command, is creative and can think big thoughts and have them accepted. But the corporate culture has to accept that in most cases. So when someone like that and I get into a dialogue, very often, not always, very often there's a way of developing that individual's expectations so that A, they accommodate the corporate culture and get along in it, and or B, work over time to leave. I call it the billiard ball theory, where you line things up so that eventually you can work things out in your favor. And having done that myself, to me this is the, as I think I said before, the road less traveled. It's the way of really succeeding on your own terms. You know, that Frank Sinatra song, if those of you are old enough to remember, My Way. I did it my way. Well, I think the highly creative person very often has to do things their way if they're going to tease out the real person within themselves. And this takes a long time. It takes a long time to figure out how to do it, what to do, how to stand on one's own feet. And as I said before about authoritarianism, I should have said that very often in the young person's life who is authoritarian and or fearful, there have been unexpected turns in the road when one was young that left the individual feeling afraid, not just in theory, but because they had no control, let's say, over a parent that was abusive or a situation that was deprived or prejudice. Who knows? There's so many things that can go wrong. But this also happens with the very creative person. And surprisingly, the very creative person often comes up in an environment that is um, full of unknowns and unexpected turns. And this is part of their genius that they can adapt, and it's also part of the, it's the difficulty because there's fear involved. There's a built-in learning of helplessness. Well, let me try to summarize what is, as I said earlier, a very amorphous, formless type of exchange between two individuals who want to produce the very best in themselves. For my side, to produce the very best in myself is to serve, and to serve, as I said, upwards towards that divine love that guides me. And for the other, the very best could be so many different things. And I talked earlier about bringing out the best in a person, the person. What I mean by that is the soul, that the soul, whose organ we are, as has been said by one of the poets, is striving always upwards. But we, the human we, the carnal, material we thwart. We are usually not consciously, but fear definitely, which is why Scripture tells us fear not. There's so much to that fear not, because fear intrudes on faith and our trust and our willingness to reach out and be all that we can be at the deepest level or highest level. And I've talked about 3 different patterns. It bears repeating, and I don't know how many times I should repeat this, that those patterns they're not clear cut. They run into each other, and they're not just 3. There are an infinite number of states and stages that we go through and could go through. So all of that to say that with that learning, with that exchange of a thought for a higher thought, there's something bigger than we are, something more than we are, that begins to ignore the consensus, fear-based, rigid view and go with the flow, as they say, and work through us to produce something beautiful and something serviceable and contributive and gorgeous, really, even though it's different, it's unusual. It may not conform to what we thought we were going to do with our lives. But when all is said and done, we look back and we say, yes, this is what I was meant to do. This is what I've loved to do. It's love itself shining through me. The scripture that said, in thy light we shall see light.